لا
at
سامح
some
الله
point.
انا اروح لطبيب، طبيب يقول لي انت بيك سكر، اظل
Right.
اكل انا
لا.
بقلاوه كل يوم. يعني لازم
لا.
لازم.
Okay, you're in denial 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, that's it. And then you have to stand up
لا مش بس هذا.
face
انت
يعني.
انا اقول لك يعني تخيلي مره من المرات كان في شيء طلع من هذا المحكمة العدل، قضية قطر، موضوع كان جدا شائك وصعب.
حساس.
طيب أنا هو قال أنت سوي، أنا ما أقدر يعني سويت.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Winter School program at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Well, it's an honor to have with us Professor Ellen Last, and I'm very pleased to introduce you well briefly. She is the founding director of the programs on governance and local development at Yale University and University of Gothenburg. She's also a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg. She serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the Project on Middle East Democracy in Washington, D.C. Professor Last has conducted fieldwork and implemented surveys in Egypt, Jordan, Libya, Morocco, Palestine, Syria, and Tunisia. She was a co-founder of the Transitional Governance Project and a founding associate editor of the Middle East Law and Governance, and currently chairs its board of directors. Professor Last has authored numerous books, textbooks, and articles. Her current research is aimed at developing local governance indicators and examining the role of social institutions in good governance. Today, she will be giving a lecture based on her most recent book titled Everyday Choices, the Role of Competing Authorities and Social Institutions in Politics and Development. The book is published online by Cambridge University Press. It's an open source, so everyone can download it for free. Without further ado, Professor Last, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Hello?
The guys.
Okay, does that work better? Aha, okay, thanks. So good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all, and I appreciate your interest in coming out. I'm going to be presenting the framework of the book that was just discussed. I also happy to tell you that there's an audio version of this that both my husband, as Stephen Degwa, and Kathy Boone have said would be good for putting a person to sleep. So if you want to have a cure for insomnia, you can download it at our website, and I have a card up here that has a QR code for that. So just to let you know. But what I really want to do is to present this framework, think about how it ties into our sort of broader discussion about political culture, and also let you know that this is kind of the framework that's the basis of the work that I'm doing moving forward. So I'm really interested in critical feedback and kind of pushing, and as well as thinking about where else can this apply and what questions it might help to answer. So this isn't one of those this is a book, it's done, please don't ever bother me about it again, but it really is something I'm hoping that we can engage with. And I'm hoping also that it becomes a framework that allows us to start to think about where our own research fits. So when you're doing research, to think about how it might fit in the context of this, so we can sort of understand better how different research fits together. I'll explain all of that in a bit more, I think. Let's start with thinking about what does competing authorities and social institutions have to do with political culture, right? So the first point I want to make is that we've talked about culture, and when we talk about culture is a mindset, assumptions about meaning, sort of sets of potential actions and associated values, as Elkins and Simmons did, or about sort of the kind of a theory of code. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that, right? So there's the idea that when I sort of perform an action or say something, the way that you understand it, if we share culture, is one way, right? If we don't share culture, as we've all very well aware, you can entirely misunderstand what the meaning is, right? And you entirely misunderstand what the meaning is because you don't necessarily know how that action or that set of words fits into a sort of a broader set of assumptions, right? So that's one way of thinking about why, sort of assumptions about actions, about what's appropriate, inappropriate, who has authority, under what conditions you're supposed to do things. The kinds of things that we think about as social institutions are very important, right? The other thing that we sort of have talked about, and Professor Basara talked about this yesterday as well, is the idea to it that when we think about culture, we actually have multiple cultures, right? So we know that it's not a single culture, but it's also, and we're all very well aware of this, that we are members of different communities that have different cultures. And that's what I'm going to mean by when I talk about competing communities and competing authorities, is that there's various sets of communities of which we're members of, and that we can think about this as being a different way of understanding political culture, sort of the multiplicity of them and the competition between them. So then the goals today is to first, like I said, to present this framework. I'm interested in critical feedback. I hope that people will pick it up and find it useful for their own work as well, right? And I'm also hoping that this will allow us to think through some of the questions that have started to be raised about, understanding the strength and importance of different sets of the state versus other sets of authorities, right? So this question that was raised in the lecture yesterday about how, there's times when the state is dominant, there's times when it isn't, but this is going to get us to sort of thinking about when do we think the state will be dominant, and if it's not, then what other competing authorities and institutions are, right? And then understanding why some of the times that we have expectations over sort of democratization, for instance, why do those expectations often not be fulfilled, right? So we can have an idea that democratization leads to economic development and growth and all sorts of things. A lot of times people are very frustrated because it doesn't, but I would argue that's because those are not always the places, the sort of the state institutions that have become democratized are not always where power lies. And when it's not where power lies and it's not where resources are distributed, then it's not a surprise that you can change the political system or the state institutions and not get the outcomes that you expect. So let's step back and think about why we might want to take a perspective of what I call everyday choices. That is thinking about politics and development outcomes from the perspective of the individuals who are engaging in them, right? So there was a comment made yesterday that ultimately we can think of everything as, being at the individual level. That's really right? So this is a picture of voters standing in line in the Egyptian elections, or elections in Egypt, right? And, in sort of a perfect world, if you're a statist who believes in democracy, et cetera, they should be standing there thinking about, which candidate is going to give them the best policies and the best outcomes, and that's what, kind of elections should be about, right? We can also, though, recognize that they're thinking about who it is that is their, cousin's friend that they know that they need to be voting for, or who it is that sort of comes from the mosque that was being promoted. And so there's a lot of other points that are going through individuals' minds as they're standing in line and thinking about who they're voting for, and they
طبعا هذه في مرحلة ما بعد السيسي، وقد يقول لماذا عليهم أن يفكروا بالسياسات، لكن هذه صورة من الولايات المتحدة. في الانتخابات الأمريكية أيضا الناس يقررون لمن
the one who's being sort of put forth. And it's also, if you say, okay, well, that maybe when people go to the voting booth, it doesn't affect them. We do know that there were people in communities, for instance, who would either be, especially during the Trump elections, who would either be pro or anti-Trump, who would be afraid to put out lawn signs to actually say who they wanted to support, because Now we all know this. I see
اجتماعية
some of you
أيضا.
nodding your head.
طبعا
Yes, that's right,
البعض
that's right.
يهز
And I
رأسه
appreciate that. And we have
متفقا
terms
معي
for
وأنا
this in a
أقدر
sense, right? We
ذلك.
talk about clientelism, we talk about corruption, we talk about traditional authorities. We have
نحن
these kind of
نتحدث عن
vague
الفساد
terms,
وعن
which
سلطات
essentially
تقليدية
in some ways boil
أحيانا
down to
بشكل
meaning it doesn't
غامض.
work the way that it should work. If you're kind of coming from a democratic theory perspective with regards to elections or thinking about accountability and government. Sort of talking about these things, right? But what I would submit is that we don't have very good ways of understanding what is important or being able to kind of really sort of theoretically separate and distinguish between different things, right? Corruption can come from very, very many different places. Clientelism can have lots of different forms. And we don't want to simply name it, we want to be able to understand it. So my concern has been that the sort of the conventional perspectives that help us to understand these things are both sort of siloed, I would argue, and also incomplete, right? So let's think about what the sort of dominant literature, and here it's really mostly the dominant political science literature, and that's who I'm predominantly speaking to. So, you know, I think a lot of times anthropologists or sociologists are going to be like, yeah, we know this, right? And I appreciate that. And I've got to be honest, I mean, you know, there's times when sort of the economists have decided that the state made a difference and politics exist, that as a political scientist, I was like, yes, we know this. So recognize that this is predominantly sort of aimed at an audience of people who studied development and these kinds of outcomes from the political science perspective. Right? So one set of literature, and I would argue the dominant literature, is very state-centric, right? It sees state versus non-state actors as being kind of the ways of understanding things. It focuses predominantly on the state. So we have a lot of studies that will talk about, you know, majoritarian and proportional representation and the outcomes we should get, or talk about democracies versus autocracies, and really avoid any sort of discussion of other sets of factors that come in. We have a second set of literature that really thinks a little bit more about these other factors, but often decides a priori which ones matter. So, for example, literature on identity or ethnicity and politics. Literature on religion and politics has decided from the outset that the other sort of set of authorities and institutions that we're interested in are religious or are ethnic, and it sort of takes the sort of moves from there. But also very much tries to understand how they engage with the state, so the state is the major interlocutor. There's a second set of literature, which I will think of as the social institutions literature, right? So while the first literature often will talk about ethnic groups and make assumptions, for instance, about, you know, whether or not, like, you know, co-ethnics will support each other and they will not support non-co-ethnics, for instance. The second set of literature is looking a little bit more deeply at the sort of the differences of social institutions. So, for example, there's some nice literature that by Rachel Brulé about thinking about matrilineal and patrilineal sort of lineage systems and how that might make a difference in terms of support for taxation or other sets of sort of policies, right? So they've done more work at trying to understand these distinctions, right, which I think is important, but there's still not as much sort of interest in kind of comparing across different sets of institutions or thinking about why the strength of those institutions might differ. And then there's an element of this literature which you can also sort of put in that, you know, kind of the state-centric literature, things like, you know, Helmke and Levitsky's sort of distinction and discussion about social institutions, which really basically goes back to, or what they call informal institutions, which really goes back to thinking about, you know, institutions that are A, affecting the state, right, but B, they sort of, they conflate informal and social. Right? So there's a notion that all social institutions are informal institutions, and by doing that, it doesn't allow us to actually sort of think about, does it matter if a social institution is formalized or not, right? Something that Sam Bowles has looked at quite extensively, and I think is an important question that we'll come back to. The third set of literature, which is actually two literatures, I've sort of combined them, but one is on hybridity and the other is on intersectionalities, right? And these actually get a little bit closer to what I'm thinking about. And they're recognizing that people have multiple sets of authorities and multiple sets of obligations and institutions that they have to respond to. they often think about that as an amalgamation, right? So there's an idea that, that people are out and have these various sets of authorities. So how does that then sort of create kind of a different understanding of things like electoral rules or things like sort of bureaucratic rules than we might expect at the outset? I think that's a very useful literature. The problem with me, to my mind, with that is that it still doesn't give us a sort of a framework and a way to think about which sets of institutions matter. And because it sort of thinks of it as amalgamation rather than trying to sort of separate it often also doesn't give us very much sort of insight into what we might think of as, theories that allow us to have any predictive power. To be fair, many of them actually say that this is exactly not what they want to do, right? So it's more advocacy, it's more sort of descriptive in many ways. So to sum, there's a set of problems that I think that we face when we're trying to understand political behavior and development. So one is that we often sort of assume rather than interrogate what are the sets of institutions, right? And that leads us to simply thinking about when things don't fit, kind of calling them things like corruption or clientelism. It overlooks then sort of differences of context. So people talk about contextual factors. This has become a big thing, especially for those who are working on sort of randomized control trials and coming out of that experimental frame that have found that things that worked in one place often don't work either in the same place at another point in time, or they don't work in different places even in the same country. And so people now sort of have this broad sense of contextual factors, but we don't have a very good way of understanding how to sort of theorize about what those contextual factors are. Again, I think that this then also helps us to think about how can we aggregate findings. This book took me, it's 65 pages, it's not a long text. It took me forever to write, and that's because everything was relevant. There's a huge, huge literature that's relevant to it, and yet at the same time, it was very hard to sort of take one study and another study and understand where they were, what they were studying. What was this question yesterday? What is this a case of? And there's, because we don't ask these questions, we are not able to actually put things into context. Well, that's interesting. Okay. So what do I want to do? I want to do, today at first I want to posit that the way to think about these is to sort of take it from the individual's perspective. So what does an individual see themselves as doing when they're going to a ballot box, when they're going to, to decide who to serve if they're a bureaucrat? What is it actually that they see as the sets of obligations, the sets of authorities that are relevant to them? Recognizing, second, that individuals are not only sort of members of multiple communities that make claims on them, but also then setting the state and these other sets of authorities and institutions on the sort of the same theoretical level. Right? So not privileging the state and then seeing these other things as residual, not deciding a priority that religion matters and ethnicity doesn't, but really sort of thinking about what is it that individuals see when they go to make these choices. And then I want to sort of argue that this should prompt us to reconsider how we think about, kind of institutions associated with politics and development. But I also hope that it will help us to kind of continue to think about what we mean by political culture and how we might be able to make sense of it. Okay. Bueno, we're clear? Awesome. So I've talked a lot about this. I haven't used the words arenas of authority as much as I sometimes do, but this idea that individuals have lots of different, I'm both a professor and I'm also a mother and I'm also, have lots of different roles. And in many cases with these different roles, they're coming with different sets of authorities and obligations, right? So how do we think about what is an arena of authority? We think about this very much actually as a football arena, and of course in Doha right now, there's plenty of ideas of understanding about football arenas, right? We have, basically you can be inside the arena or out, so we have a sense of membership, right? We have a kind of a sense of clear boundaries, right? I know when I'm in, I know when I'm out. I might be a member because I wanted to be. I may be a member because I just happened to be born into it, and it's not a choice, right? So we can think about voluntary and involuntary sort of membership, right? But we also have a sense of shared goals, and I think this one is important to sort of emphasize, right? Because you may think to yourself, wait a second, I know in my religious congregation we do not have shared goals. Those people want this and I want this, right? And so we can certainly have disputes within them. We can have disputes over who has power. We can have disputes over who has, what's the direction we're taking, what is it that we are, right? But what we don't have a dispute over and have a shared goal in is the perpetuation of the community, right? So to that extent, we can think about these communities as having boundaries, membership, and then shared goals. And again, examples are religious congregations, there's ethnic communities, all sorts of communities. So within those, we can think about what are the social institutions. And there's lots of different ways of defining social institutions. What I'm taking is something quite close to sort of Elinor Ostrom's definition of it. I like to think about roles, rules, and rewards. Partly I like alliteration, so it gives me 3 R's, and that makes me happy. But also just because I think it forces us to think about the various components, right? I mean, to some extent, what roles exist are determined by what the rules are. So there's an overlap, and it's sort of in a kind of, these are not necessarily 3 totally distinct components, right? But we can think about, are people, leaders or followers? We can think about what are the roles of women versus men in different organizations, right? So this question about, what are you allowed to do under what kinds of conditions, right? And that those might differ depending on what your position is within the organization. The rules are, there's questions about, basically what's permitted or not in terms of actions, under what conditions, and then to what consequences, right? So it's quite straightforward. And then the rewards can be social, they can be material, they can be all sorts of other ways in which we are rewarded for following the expectations of those around us, whether we're talking about neighborhoods and who's a leader in a neighborhood and who's a follower or who's a sort of just a member of the community. We're talking about who's able to make decisions, who's able to have access to land, et cetera. Okay. So that should lead to some questions. Okay, the first question is which arenas matter, right? And why do they do so? And so that's difficult in the sense that we all know that there's multiple sort of arenas, and in any one condition, we don't expect that every sort of community that you're a member of is affecting whether or not how you're going to vote or who you're going to serve or how you're going to act. But we want to have some ways of thinking about this, right? So the first point I want to make is that we can think about it, and I'll actually put all this out. By the way, I'm going to give you evidence. I've done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa now as well, so I'm giving you evidence that's from Africa as well as from the Middle East and North Africa. So the first thing that we can think about is domain congruence, right? And this is the idea that not everything that that you sort of engage in matters to sort of the all of the communities that you're a member of, right? So how much does it really, is this really an issue that is of interest to the authority that and the community that you're a part of? And so here's what we've done, and so basically where you have kind of a higher match, right? And here we think about it in terms of scope and expertise, right? Where you have a higher match, then there should be more power of that community over the choices that you make, all right? And so here what we've done in Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi is where this is coming from, and it's done with Kristen Gao and with Kate Baldwin. We're looking at sort of thinking about state and customary authorities, right? And we're thinking about the sort of the most local and then kind of supra-local, kind of more regional levels. And so the a priori expectation is that the state should have much more to do, sort of be seen as more in the purview of, who should you be voting for as a presidential candidate or MP candidate. And should have more to do with sort of schools, because schools are under the state's domain, right? And where customary authorities should have more to do with kind of customary traditions and institutions, which in this case is the burial funds. So what we're doing in this particular research project is looking at the extent to which when people are asked, your local chief has asked you to contribute to a burial fund, your local chief has asked you to contribute to a school fund, your MP has asked you to vote for this presidential candidate, your local chief has asked you to vote for this presidential candidate. So it's an experiment, a survey experiment. Then who actually do people say, are they more willing to say, I'm gonna be, doing what you've asked me to do, or what they've asked me to do? And what we find is that where we have sort of congruence, in other words, these matches, that the MP is actually more likely to be able to get some people to vote for the presidential candidate than to get them to be able to, say they're willing to contribute to a burial fund. The village, the customary authority is more likely to be able to get them to say they'll go to the burial fund than they'll vote for the presidential candidate. That congruence actually makes a difference. Okay, so that's the first thing. Is simply does this activity that the person is engaged in seem to actually have something to do with this community and this set of authorities? We can also think, though, about the strength of different arenas, right? So it's not necessarily just how much do these activities and authorities match. And in fact, what we find in that earlier experiment is that while there's those differences in the willingness to say, I'm going to do this, are affected by the congruence. Overall, the local chief had a lot more ability to get people to do anything than the MP did, right? So basically, there's other ways in which we can think about where do we get strength, right? So one point is to think about kind of the level of solidarity, right? How much does my membership in this community matter to me, right? And where it doesn't matter much and where we don't think that people are going to care about what I do and nobody really sort of has an investment in it, then it's not as sort of powerful as communities in which there's a lot of solidarity. And we all know this actually from our own experience of being either engaged in sort of groups and communities that really people sort of hold together and sort of see themselves as striving together or not, right? The second issue is about what we call encompassing authority, and this is a sort of more novel idea in a sense, and that is that some authorities have a lot to do with a lot of aspects of life, right? So, I may be in a religious congregation or a religious group that decides, who's eligible to be married, and it decides whether or not I'm going to have social standing, and if I'm going to be eligible, in the sort of eligibility pool because I'm considered to be a good member. It might decide whether I'm going to have access to resources, I'm going to have land, so we can actually be in a community that has a lot to do with a lot of aspects of our lives, right? We can also be in them that have very little to do with it. It matters for whether or not I'm going to get a paycheck and sort of have, but I've got a lot of other options in terms of how I spend my time. I've got, it doesn't affect who I'm going to marry. And so in a sense, there's a much kind of more narrow sort of a set of authority. And we find, by the way, in our work that, this can depend on the nature of the community. It can also depend on the nature of the individual, which I'll come to in a second. And the third is the extent to which information flows, right? So a lot of actions, are you going to know whether or not I did that? Is this a place where people are actually communicating, where everybody knows everybody's business, right? Which you can also think about differences in the nature of localities, right? Sort of remember once in, I'm going to tell you guys, but when I was first married in Syria, my way of dealing with being angry was to go out on a very vigorous walk. And I would do that in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It was totally fine. Nobody cared. I went home. It was all good, right? I did it in Zebedani, Syria, right? I went out for this very vigorous walk. I was screaming, came back. My mother-in-law's, what's up with this? I've got phone calls coming down. What's wrong with the American, right? So, there's different communities in terms of what you can then do because is information going to flow quickly? And again, here we have, I've got to double check my time. Not good. So here we've done, again, another experiment. What we're finding here is that proximate leaders, those who are kind of more close, and including neighbors in this case, have more ability to get people to do things than those who are kind of more distant. We also, again, I mentioned this, a minute ago. We also see that there's differences in kinds of the individual characteristics. So some individuals are, they're independently wealthy. They don't have to care what other people think. And in fact, we find a lot of times that change comes from people, social changes come from people who are, relatively wealthy and don't have to care what other people think and what kinds of sanctions can be imposed on them, right? So we get those types of differences. We, of course, get differences in terms of kind of just how many communities are around an individual. So this is coming from older work that I did in 2009 in Jordan. And at the time, I sort of thought about this as competitive clientelism, right? The idea that you ended up with, some basically, it wasn't, am I going to vote for you, right? It was, are we going to mobilize our group versus you're going to mobilize your group? Because we knew that who at the end of the day was obligated to help me was, say, for example, my tribe, the member of my tribe. It wasn't going to be that the member of another tribe was going to help me. That's fine, but what I also found at that time was that made a lot more difference in the rural areas, right, than it did in Amman. And it makes sense, right, that essentially, in areas where, kind of tribal community relations are so much more important, then people are both more likely to go out and vote, right? So it's like 80% in rural areas, 30% in the capital city, and that they're more likely to vote for tribal leaders, much higher in the rural areas than in the urban city where they were more likely to vote for the Islamists. Right? So just able to think about the extent to which these kinds of holds over individuals then determines what they would be willing to do. So that's one set of questions. First of all, is just who matters, right? But we've mentioned before that we have also within these different sets of obligations, right? So to some extent, this is very contextual and very specific, right? But it means I'll come back to this, but it sort of says something about how we should do our work. So, we can say, okay, religious authorities really matter a lot. And I'm interested in understanding how that might affect whether or not people will be vaccinated. And we see, even actually there's a study done in Utah or Idaho or someplace out west. It's embarrassing, I can't distinguish between those. That, found that basically the religious leader actually had more importance in terms of deciding whether people would be willing to get vaccinated than did the kind of the local health authorities. But so we see that, on the one hand, whether I get vaccinated and how that religious, kind of authority might matter depends on whether or not I'm in a religion that says, you should never sort of seek medical care outside of God, versus one that says, this is part of God's will, you should go seek a vaccination, right? So part of it is very specific, but I would argue that there's three sets of rules that we can look at. So we can recognize the importance of specific rules, but we can also look at very kind of broad sets. Let me put these all up. So one is thinking about leadership selection, right? And that's just, basically we have good evidence that the extent to which individuals sort of have responsiveness can depend on the extent to which there's competition among leaders. It's interesting. I mean, it sort of parallels what we think about democracies versus autocracies, but it sort of really finds this, for example, in Ella Gau's work, where she finds that municipal service delivery is higher in places where there's more sort of tribes and competition. We can also think about examining kind of engagement, and here individualist versus collectivist rules I think are really important. And this is one of the things that sort of has bothered me for a very long time about the way in which we often study things. So we study votes, for example, and the thinking about vote buying is as an individual relationship. And, okay, I have 10 minutes left, in case you're all wondering. So the way we think about vote buying is it's an individual relationship, right? Like, the candidate, buys the votes of an individual. But we also know that there's many places in which it's not about that individual choice. It's about what it reflects on those around me and how that then actually sort of affects what I do, right? So we need, I think, to think a lot more about whether or not we're talking about a place. And this was raised us yesterday as well when Azmi, when you were talking about sort of you didn't call it collectivist and individualist, but really thinking about the extent to which it's communal versus individualist kind of underpinnings of the groups that we're looking at. A third set is to think about group boundaries and group maintenance rules. And these I find very interesting, right? So group boundaries and group maintenance rules are those that help to sort of distinguish ourselves. You can think about it in terms of, dress, for example, that, there's certain ways in which you can dress to show that you're a Hasidic Jew or that you're sort of a member of a community, but also about actions. And a lot of times group boundary sort of rules suggest that we don't stand up and say to, publicly, right? There's the idea I can criticize you privately if we're a member of a group, but publicly we sort of put together kind of a sense that which we all belong together. And I saw this very clearly when I was doing some work in Libya, was around 2012, and I was talking to sort of one of the people who was a member of the GNC, and he said to him, you know, he said he was giving me the kind of how a set of minor tribes had come together, formed a list, and then succeeded in the area he was. And one thing that he said that was interesting was that they met at weddings, right? And they met at weddings because they knew that the, you know, major tribes wasn't coming to the wedding. They could meet and it wouldn't sort of raise any eyebrows. But then he said the usual, like, you know, we had 5,000 in this tribe and 3,000 in that and 2,000 in this, and we knew that we could beat the other tribe that had 8,000, and so that was why we did this. And I said, well, you know, what would happen if, you know, people don't vote for you? I mean, why do you think everybody who is in your tribe is going to vote for you? And he said, no, of course they're not going to. But he said, in a sense, which is not quite the way he put it, you know, there's an equal probability that they're not going to vote for them and they're not going to vote for us, so we're all, you know, it's all good. But then he said, what they can't do is stand up and publicly say that they're not going to vote for us. Right? That sort of crosses a line. You can not vote is fine, but you can't publicly sort of disagree with it, which has interesting implications for how we think about whether or not, you know, what people think and take as the signals for how much support there is for different candidates, right? But it's also a really good example of the sort of the need to demonstrate cohesion and how that, you know, sort of has an impact on the political behavior. I also saw this in the kind of the sort of devising of the electoral rules. And here I think it's important to sort of take a look at this because it suggests that what we think of as state institutions, right, can be understood also as social institutions. So essentially in Libya, they wanted to, I won't go into the details, but they basically wanted to strengthen parties but knew that people weren't very fond of parties, especially since you were seen as a traitor if you were in a party under Gaddafi. And they also wanted to sort of recognize the importance then of having individual seats. And they were getting pressures to do both. So they came up with the idea that they were going to do a two-tiered system. They were going to have 80 seats that were basically PR seats, and they were going to have 120 individual seats. And in the minds of the people who were coming up with this was a kind of the German two-tiered system, right? Nice and easy. You've got like the PR seats here, you've got the individual seats here. It's all very kind of clean and easy, et cetera. So they put this out and they tell people, you know, you're going to have this number of seats and these are the districts, and all of a sudden they're getting delegations visiting them, they're getting sort of phone calls ringing, and basically you had an entire sort of set of the region which said, we're not going to, I forgot to tell you one thing, they're also going to do a zipper system, right? Zipper quotas for gender. So, and while Tunisia had done a zipper system that was every list had to be male, female, they hadn't sort of required what they also call as a horizontal list zipper, so that every other list has to start with a male or female. So they do that in Libya as well, and they announced this. And it seems very progressive and very clean and neat for the sort of the election engineers. And then they get this sort of this backlash. And the backlash is twofold. It's on the one hand, people saying, look, you know, we can't get women to put their name on the list, yet alone to go to Tripoli if they win, right? That's just not what women do here, right? And the not what women do here is not about the politics, right? It's about sort of what socially women do here. And secondly, in a lot of these areas, there's sort of the relations between neighboring areas were not necessarily so good. So you're going to tell me there's a chance that my representative is going to be from them? So the result was this. The result was that after all these negotiations and people who held out and wouldn't sort of, you had a place like Herian, which was kind of rural Rifi, that had only majoritarian seats. You ended up with a lot of the PR seats being pushed to Benghazi and to Tripoli and to the places where they would accept them, right? You had the electoral engineers sort of screaming, these people don't understand, right? This is a mess, because from an electoral administration perspective, this is a mess, right? So this is a mess, why don't they understand this? And basically, you could also say that in the sort of the attempt to design the system, also, why didn't you understand this, right? So there was no attempt to sort of think about what were the social rules that would affect this. We see this elsewhere. We saw this, Intisar Khariji has done a really great dissertation that if anybody's interested in decentralization and boundary drawing, it should read it. I know that sounds very narrow. It's really not. But she shows that you saw exactly that same kind of Libyan sort of backlash taking place over boundaries in Tunisia and often led to sort of the redrawing of districts. In contrast, I would argue that Jordan's electoral reforms to one person, one vote, while it also got a lot of backlash, was actually taking advantage of understanding how people would respond to tribes versus responding to other sets of communities. So I'm recognizing I'm running out of time. I'm going to try to make this semi-short. We can also think about this in terms of congruency. A lot of times when people talk about sort of, cleavages and ethnic congruency, they think about sort of whether or not ethnic or different groups sort of are congruent. In other words, are they nested or are they not in terms of identities? I would argue that we don't want to think about it in terms of identities. We want to think about it whether or not the expectations that come out of those groups are congruent or not. It doesn't matter if they're congruent in terms of, how much our groups overlapping or separate, but rather not the expectations are. And I'm going to actually skip that. Finally, I just want to sort of end with sort of thinking a little bit about what I see as implications for the study of politics and development, and we can add political culture. One is I'm sort of urging us to reverse the way that we've often studied things, right? We often study things by saying, okay, let's take this system and therefore think about how people act, or let's take these two sets, religion and politics, and think about how people act. And I'm asking us to think about what do people see themselves as engaging in? What do they understand that, how, to what extent do these sort of different communities and different authorities and institutions are relevant to the questions or the actions that they're going to take? And therefore, what do we expect individuals to do, and ultimately how does that aggregate to outcomes? So it's trying to sort of flip the way that we think about it. Asks us to rethink informality and formality. We actually have done some work that shows that people don't necessarily care whether it's a state or kind of a local customary authority that has granted a sort of formal rights to land, like land property rights, but they actually care whether or not there's formal rights. So formality matters independently of the kind of the sort of the authority behind it. Also asks us to think about how we can measure local governance and processes. I'm happy to talk about this for like a whole other lecture in terms of, how we can measure these and make sense of the distinctions. But this is an example of the local governance process indices that we've done. And I think it raises a lot of new questions, right? So, it really asks us to sort of step back and think about how authorities and institutions, how authorities and communities compete over how individuals act, and therefore, what's the implications of that for different sets of institutions and different sets of behaviors. That's a project, by the way, a collaborative project that I'm about ready to start. So if people are working on competing authorities, please contact me and let me know, because that's something that's on the action. We asked us to think about bridge actors, people who have actually sort of important roles in more than one of these types of communities, to then think about how these sort of things aggregate to the end in terms of outcomes and expectations. I will leave it. You're getting very nervous. I'm never going to stop. I will stop there.
You've done very well in terms of time. Thank you so much for your invaluable lecture. Thank you. That's really a lot to think about. So time to turn to the floor. We'll take a round of questions of probably 3 or 4 to start with. Okay, Dr. Elizabeth, then. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth Kassab from the philosophy department here. Ellen, thank you very much. As a layperson, it makes total sense to me. I have a Lebanese question to you. All of this is obvious for me. I mean, for many of us in the area, take Iraq, the non-state institutions are there, and the way the question has been put, or the way we have been raising the question about democratic political culture, is how do we cross from our social institutions to the state institutions? How does your layout help us better look at the struggle of people who are realizing, I mean, the bad words cannot but come back to my mind, of clientelism and corruption and the disaster that they have created. How does this framework help us better study the struggles of people?
Thank you so much for this rich presentation. My name is Silvia Nicola. I'm from the Free University of Berlin. And what I was thinking about while listening to you is, and I made an assumption and I wanted to check if this assumption is correct. So this framework that you were putting forward, can it be only used in understanding contexts where peace has been established in the sense of the negative peace, or which role does violence play in the societies? Because everyday choices are being constrained in a whole different way when direct violence or structural violence, but mostly direct violence is present. Thank you.
Here.
Thank you so much for this. It was a very interesting lecture, and I have two questions here. The first one is about like which community has more, effect on the voting behavior or something like that, because in the last slide, like you have showed some diagrams, it starts with the family and then like the other parts of the community. But and the second question is, does the democratic socialization, I mean, someone was brought up in democratic society or democratic state, which he has, the culture of voting, starting from the free and fair elections in schools for the student union and WASO until he becomes like more than 18 years old and he has the right to vote after. Does this matter with the political culture and the behavior also of voting and WASO? And thank you so much for this. Is a very interesting lecture.
Thank you. We'll take one more question. Yeah, Jensen.
Thank you for the lecture. I thought it was insightful and raised a lot of questions. I wanted to ask about sort of one of the potential puzzles that might arise when we focus on the individual as your unit of analysis. I wonder if you've ever thought about the extent to which individuals' decisions are actually authentic or are they more like a byproduct of the social institution in which they are enculturated in? And one like specific kind of fancy political science term is like preference falsification. And I wonder if your kind of framework makes sense of this, and kind of how should we think about the ways in which like decisions are actually mapping onto what individuals want, or are they just a byproduct of like institutions?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So in terms of thinking about Lebanon, what does it ask us to think through? So one way to think about it is to ask, let me step back. Melanie Kamet's work, right, where she's looking at, where do you basically sort of give service to kind of outgroups, and how does sectarian politicians mobilize, et cetera, is an interesting example. In my framework, here's how I would read that. I would read that sectarian politicians can have two sets of obligations, because politicians are like any other individual. I mean, they're deciding, do I serve this place or do I serve that place, and our parties are the same, right? So in cases where their sectarian is dominant, their sect is dominant enough that they're going to win, right? Then there's actually no distinction between I want to be able to be elected in the future, I need to have a majority, and I want to serve my sect. So what we see is that they predominantly serve their sect, and they don't really do outgroup service as much. Okay, in areas where they have the challenge that if I serve my sect and don't do outgroup service, then if I privilege my sect, right, then don't do outgroup service as much, then I'm going to lose because I don't have enough. Versus if I give outgroup service, I'm going to do better. Then they're actually in this place where they're not congruent. The sort of sectarian and the party sort of demands are not congruent, and they have to make a choice. And what's interesting is they often are making the choice towards the party when they're deciding that they're going to sort of go towards outgroup, right? So that's one way in which this helps us to think about what's the relative importance for a politician, right, over the kind of the sectarian expectations versus the political party expectations, right? So a second way in which I hope that this can help to understand Lebanon is to think about what areas, so that's talking about what types of actors might be willing to move towards the state for their own aggrandizement. I'm not saying for great reasons, right? But the other way to think about it is to think about what individuals become independent, right? And you see, I mean, you do see kind of a movement from sets of people that are anti-sectarian, kind of old politics, et cetera. I mean, they're coming from the places where my framework would expect them to come from, people who are more educated, more wealthier, more urban. I mean, so in a sense, it helps us to think about where are those pockets, right? Where are the pockets of people who would start to, and what are the factors that will affect that? Unfortunately, the economic collapse right now is not helping in the right direction, right? Because we can say, okay, well, that's taking people out of the system fully, like leaving. It's also taking, resources out of from people and making them more dependent on some of these kind of groups. So I think what I would say is it helps us to understand where we can get potential expectations for change in one direction or another, what types of forces might lead to, kind of promoting that, or lead to decline. That's what I think can be useful of the framework towards a question like Lebanon. By the way, when you said this is all obvious, I agree with you. I mean, to me, this is all obvious. I don't think it's not. It's what's surprising to me and what's really bothered me the last 20 years of being a political scientist is the fact that it is so obvious, except for it's not reflected in the ways in which we theorize and that we study these things. Sylvia, so no, actually, I think that this is applicable both to cases where there's conflict, ongoing violent conflict, and when there's just, kind of what we think of as everyday, kind of average peaceful engagement. And in fact, in the book, I use some of kind of Ana Arjona's work about Colombia and rebel groups, because that's one form and set of authorities and communities, as well as others. And I also want to be really clear that I guess I've focused more today about kind of positive incentives, but there are plenty of negative incentives, right? So this is neither about saying that things are about carrots or sticks or coercion and violence, et cetera, but it's just sort of more general. So thinking about thinking about who, kind of what's the most important arena for deciding when you're voting. In that nested diagram, I didn't mean to throw you all off on that. It's just because families are smaller and tend to be in ethnic groups. I mean, that was just about the ways in which groups would be nested. But the thinking about who plays an important role really gets back to this question about, which communities have and which authorities have influence at a particular point in time. So, Michael Fischbach did really nice work on thinking about, families and the extent to which, people vote with the fathers or the patriarch, and they do so because the patriarch has a lot to say about how their life is going to be. And he has this great quote where he basically says, yeah, it'd be nice if you were going to vote for the, somebody that you thought might make a change today, but the chance of that is pretty low, and you're going to be with, there's a temporal element here too. You're going to be with your, with your patriarch for a very long time, right? So that's a case where that would matter. But, in other cases where people are much more mobile, or where families don't have that many resources or don't have that much hold, or don't believe they should have that much hold, then you would see something very different. Final question was about preference falsification. And yes, it's true that I actually don't address the question of whether or not people are doing this because they really, want and believe in it, or because of the institutions. I take an approach that basically says they do it because of the institutions, and if all else sort of equal and there's no sort of sets of incentives, et cetera, they may just do what they prefer. What I don't do is think about, what about when people have very strong kind of individual beliefs and say, I'm willing to pay the costs, except to the extent to which we think about which sets of individuals would be more able to do that, where the costs of not doing what the institutions suggest would be lower. Yeah.
Okay, we can take another round of questions. Yes.
Oh, great work, Ellen. I just have a question. I don't want to put you in a box, but I'm really trying to put your framework or align it with just some sort of theory. And I just want to ask, what do you identify your work as or your framework? Do you see yourself as a rationalist and an instrumentalist, especially your work on Africa? Since, with a lot of the African literature, we do tend to identify ourselves with just one school. So what do you identify as? If you do, if you don't, that's fine.
So I asked, I'm going to answer this with an anecdote. I asked Bob Dahl, Bob Dahl has written probably one of the most important pieces on American politics and some of the most important pieces on comparative politics. And I'm not suggesting I'm Bob Dahl, by the way, just to be really clear. But I asked him, do you think of yourself as an Americanist? Do you think of yourself as a comparativist? Like, where do you fit? And he said, why would I pigeonhole myself? So I think that's part of the answer, right? I mean, I don't think of myself as being one thing. The one thing I would say that I am is definitely as an institutionalist, right? I mean, I think the institutions matter. I mean, this whole thing is about institutions, essentially. So I'm definitely an institutionalist, but in terms of thinking about it, in terms of, this is why solidarity and sort of identification with the group, in my view, is important, as well as, thinking about instrumental sort of reasons and, yeah.
So thank you. That was a really rich presentation. So thinking about everything we heard yesterday and listening to your analysis, I was coming back to the question in my mind, what do you think of as like the origin of your approach? So what I mean by that is thinking of all of this, social institutions. There seems to be a tension, like, do we begin with the individual encountering some environment? Do we begin by trying to understand the context, the system? Or is it more of a dialectical unfolding? I'm just curious, like, say, if I were to take your approach and try to apply it in a concrete case, which the speaker yesterday morning said we have to begin with the concrete, how would I reckon with that tension between the individual and the environment?
Mm-hmm. We'll take two more questions, West and Dr. Masri.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture and for having your book as open access, actually. I was really happy to find it. I wanted to ask about, I want to try to bring this lecture closer to the political culture. Is it echoing? Is my voice weird? There's an open mic, that's why. No? No. Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to try to bring the lecture closer to the topic of the winter school, political culture. And I was wondering if we can use the issues you highlighted with how different communities find different political leaders or chiefs more important in deciding what to do in different things. So could we, for example, use this approach to ask the question of which type of leaders hold more symbolic capital or more power over people in different political systems? So could we actually end up using this approach for the typical comparative approach we use in political culture when studying political culture? And I was wondering if we could also ask in which political systems are people more likely to conform to their community standards and in which are they less likely to conform? Not saying that it's easy to study conformity. Obviously, people can sometimes conform to resistance to standards of resistance to conformity. So, yes, and sorry, I have a few questions. My last one is, I'm wondering whether approaching this hybridity from a development studies perspective can end up being a bit problematic. Because, for example, taking the example of the religious leader who tells people not to get vaccinated. Coming from a development studies perspective, you might think, okay, let's give this religious leader or whoever some incentives to tell people to go get vaccinated. This ends up giving them legitimacy. Oh my God.
Is that right? Okay, thank you. So one last question. Yeah.
Actually, my question is related to the question that was just asked. It's on the mic. What if we try to understand how the individuals, for example, in the voting behavior, don't you think that it's different when they are voting for the local council and when they are voting to the parliament, or if it's presidency elections? So it varies, for example, the local leaders or the chief of the tribe or the religious man has maybe less influence when it's a parliamentary elections. And that takes us, to the different events when we are analyzing in the everyday or in the daily life of when they are making their choices. It depends on the event. Maybe I would assume that a religious leader would have a lot of influence when it comes to vaccine, but would have less influence when it comes to the choices of electing an MP. If you can shed the light. Thank you very much for very, very interesting and talk. Thank you.
So absolutely. In some ways, what you've described is what I'm talking about, domain congruency, right? So this idea that there are some things that some leaders should be, have a lot more say over, either because it's seen as being in their area of expertise. So we're talking about, something like, burial, which we think about as sort of a path to God and, into sort of an afterlife, and, that we might expect religious leaders to have a lot more to say over that than they do over even vaccines, right? So we can think of it in terms of expertise. We can think of it in terms of this kind of scope, like local versus, super local. There's other ways in which we might also think about what affects whether or not, this activity and that leader should have more power over certain activities. But the intuition that you're talking about is exactly what we're saying, like that there is a way in which different activities, and this is why, going back to the concrete case, that we start with thinking about what is the activity that we're looking at, what do people think that activity is about, right? So I can be voting in one case, I don't think the activity has anything to do with my allegiance to my family or my allegiance. That's not even in the realm of how I understand something like voting, right? I may be in another case where I think it has everything to do with demonstrating my allegiance, right? And people are going to be, Jordan, the tribes sit out there and they have their tribal roles and they're seeking out the people who haven't come to the polls. Well, it's not because they think that then if my tribal, if they sent a runner to come get me and take me to the polls, I don't think my decision to come to the poll right now has much to do with whether or not I'm voting for a candidate. It has everything to do with whether or not I'm demonstrating that I'm a good tribal member, right? So there's differences across contexts in terms of what are the kind of the relative strength of these different authorities, but also what do things mean? And so I focus a lot more on that in the book than I did in this presentation. But I think sometimes we assume that voting here is voting there mean the same thing. Serving somebody who's come to my office here and there means the same thing, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And we actually have to start by asking, this is the activity I'm interested in. I'm interested in voting, or I'm interested in bureaucratic service, or whatever. It can be things that we think of as political science. That's great, right? But this is the activity. What do people in this context at this point in time actually think that activity is meaning? Because it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing across. And Lisa Woodine has mentioned that long ago. This is not me sort of kind of coming up with that. So that's kind of, I hope that gives us sort of a sense of, concretely what I would say is we move away from simply saying, I expect that, this model works from here to here to here, and even, again, across sets of individuals across, if I was looking at Jordanian voting, for example, right, I would want to understand that, it can take on this range of meanings. It can take on a range of meaning about sort of obligations and kind of allegiance, and can it take on a meaning? And then understand what is it, which of these matter more for individuals, and how does the context affect that, urban, rural, different things. So I hope that helps to make that a little bit more clear. And yes, I think that it can help us to understand. Now, symbolic power is, in a sense, just one more type of authority, right? And and there's I think in my work probably tends to privilege kind of the material and social, but the in some ways when we see the social rewards of following this authority's kind of advice or this role, and the authority doesn't have to be an individual. It can be a community. It can be a set of people, but of doing what is seen as being the expected action in this group, then yes, it can help us to understand where we have that kind of authority and the extent to which that versus other sets of factors may actually matter. And then this question that I think is really interesting about, how do we understand whether or not we're legitimizing actors, right? And it gets us to a kind of more normative questions about what do we, and applied questions about what do we do with this framework if we're talking to development, specialists versus what if we're just talking to academics, right? And there, I think, one of the things it does is it helps us to think about who matters in different places, right? And so if I want to get vaccinations, then how do I understand, who would actually be able to help me sort of make sure that vaccinations are rolled out, and who do I need on board? It may be that, the religious leader is not able to be a veto player so that you don't want to. But if what I'm caring about today is actually, stopping COVID or whatever, right, then I may be much less interested in whether I'm legitimizing an actor who already has enough power that I have to actually, get them to be on board and help me to sort of get people to do something than I am. So I think there's a lot of trade-offs and questions, but what this is trying to point people to is where are inroads depending on what you want to do. I guess back to this final question, if I understood it right, about thinking about kind of do we start with the context or do we start with the the action and what does that mean? So in this book, I'm actually really interested in understanding what choices do people make at a single point in time. And I have a section where I talk about, to what extent are institutions changeable and endogeneity issues and all sorts of things that come out around that. I would say that if what I want to understand is how are people deciding to act in this election, in this office, and this vaccination drive, et cetera, then I understand the context, and then I sort of think about what individuals will do and where I can, who I need to engage, et cetera. Now, if what I want to understand is how do institutions change over time, which I think is another sort of, kind of stream of research that needs to come out of this type of a framework, right? And how do changes maybe in the power or the sort of expectations within one arena affect those within others? I think there's a whole set of really interesting questions to be asked about that. Then I would actually, then it's a different thing. Then we're really thinking about, this kind of change over time, potentially taking the individual's actions as the drivers or technological social changes as the drivers for the kinds of institutional changes that we might want to study.
I think we still have, yes, probably 1-2 more questions.
So Ellen, this was a great talk. There's so much, it's a little intimidating. And with that comes a question about how do I decide which of all these institutional connections are relevant for what I want to study. Of course, it depends in a large part, on what you want to study, and you're responsible, in a way, for hypothesizing. That's part of your job, is to be creative and insightful. But there's a broad menu of things that are potentially relevant, and you've kind of answered this partly in response to some other questions. But how do I decide what to draw upon from this really broad menu of things, all of which are convincing? I mean, we see that they are potentially relevant, and which ones are more than potentially relevant, that are actually relevant. The one slide that maybe, I don't know if there's time, but that I asked you to go back to, you had one slide where there were dependent variables. And we didn't spend a lot of time on that, but so that would be an illustration of how what you've selected to try to account for variance on these dependent variables. So maybe if there's time, or at least in terms of what people might think about, what I'm thinking about is, what were the independent variables that you used? How were you thinking about your causal story in a way that led you to pick these particular independent variables? And maybe that's enough.
Okay, so I think I'll be able to go back to the slide, and we'll do that in a second. I want to start by maybe talking a little bit about what I hope people will do with this framework, right? So what I hope will happen is that it affects people in a few different ways, and one is to sort of think about what it is that we've studied. Like I said earlier, we've got a lot of literature out there, but if I were to tell you I'm interested in studying whatever phenomenon, I'm going to study it in Oman in the Netherlands, you'd probably scowl. That's a little weird, right? I mean, Gulf, relatively authoritarian, democracy, what are you talking about? That's our first reaction. If I told you I'm going to study something and I'm going to do it in Sfax and Gafsa, or I'm going to do it in Sfax and Tunis, you may think, oh, it doesn't make much difference if it's Sfax and Gafsa or Sfax and Tunis. Whereas it actually would make quite a bit of difference in terms of kind of how social institutions matter in Tunis versus Sfax and Gafsa. So one of the things is to get us to start to actually be much more explicit to ourselves about thinking about what are the sets of authorities, the relative importance of them, whether the sort of the nature of social institutions, are these communal or individualist, et cetera. So that's part one of just what I hope is that we start to become much more explicit and then convey that so that we can start to compare across different studies and make sense of what you found here and what I found there. The second thing that I'm hoping is that people will actually pick this up and then study the various aspects of it. So I don't think any study can actually look at, who has authority and the nature of institutions, all of these different things, right? But again, if we can say, I'm going to study the aspect of who has authority, recognizing it's this type of a context, right? And saying more than just a context matters, then I think we can start to aggregate that knowledge and kind of use this framework to develop kind of a much more kind of developed theory, if you will, right? So that's the idea. That gets me to answering the question about what dependent variables. And the third part, I'm not sure if this is what you were asking, but within any case, right? What we're trying to use this for is to understand what are the sets of arenas that matter and what are the factors that tell me what matters in these different cases, right? I'll try to go back to where you wanted me to go back to. So say stop when I'm there. Wait, I'm going the total wrong way. These are all my backup slides. I have many backup slides. You thought that this was long, but it's not anything close to what it is. Oh, it's not reflecting. Oh, okay. Now it is. So, Mark, where did you want me to go to?
And variables.
Okay, so when you can see this, I guess you can see it. So this is one, right? Is this one?
I mean, if there's several, you can take whatever you find most useful. It's not the one I was thinking of, though. There is one where the word dependent variables appears, and there's some models over on the right.
Okay. This one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So this is an example. This comes from that same experiment that I did with Kate and Kristen as well, but this is done with Priska Yost. The dependent variable on this is compliance. Do individuals say that they would be willing to do the action they were asked to do, right? So what we're trying to understand here is the relative authority of different actors. So understanding the authority of village heads, of the MP and the thirdly actor, which I'm totally blanking on. So, the local counselor. So basically, in this case, that the dependent variable is compliance. The question that we're trying to dig into is authority. We've done some subsequent work where we're trying to dig in even more to what drives authority. Is it sanctioning? Is it bandwagoning? Is it the nature of the relations between the leader and community, et cetera? So I'm not attempting in my own work to say I'm going to do this full model of absolutely everything that exists, right? I'm simply saying, okay, let's take, one side of this and dig in. Let's take one side and then hope that it kind of ultimately creates a picture that, that kind of fills out. And again, my goal is to get other people to help engage in that work. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the lecture and for the question and answer part. I had a question about how you measured actually the local governance, but I think we can have that conversation later on. Thank you so much for your time and for the brilliant questions. So we have a coffee break and you're back at 11:30. Thank you.